I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the bridal suite at the Magnolia Hotel in downtown Denver, my hands trembling as I adjusted the delicate lace sleeves of my wedding dress for what felt like the 100th time. The ivory silk cascaded down my body like a waterfall, and the intricate beadwork caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. This was it, the moment I had dreamed about since I was a little girl playing dress-up in my mother's closet. After 18 months of planning, countless dress fittings, and more stress than I care to admit, I was finally going to marry Paul Richardson, the man who had swept me off my feet 3 years ago at a coffee shop on Colfax Avenue. My heart hammered against my ribcage as I thought about walking down that aisle in just 30 minutes. My maid of honor, Jessica, bustled around me like a mother hen, making sure every detail was perfect. She fluffed my veil, checked my makeup one more time, and handed me the pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. My something old. The something new was the dress itself, custom made by a boutique designer who had worked with me for months to create this masterpiece. Something borrowed was Jessica's diamond bracelet sparkling on my wrist, and something blue was the tiny sapphire sewn into the hem of my dress. I felt like a princess from a fairy tale, and for the first time in weeks, the anxiety that had been gnawing at my stomach began to settle. Paul had seemed distant lately, working longer hours at his law firm and spending more time with his best friend Andrew, but I chalked it up to pre-wedding jitters. The photographer knocked on the door, and I took one final look at myself in the mirror. My dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, with a few loose curls framing my face. The makeup artist had done an incredible job. My green eyes looked larger and more luminous than ever, and my lips were painted a soft rose color that complemented the warm undertones of my skin. I had lost 15 pounds for this day, hitting the gym religiously and following a strict diet that had left me feeling confident and radiant. This dress, this moment, this day, everything was exactly as I had envisioned it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the white roses and baby's breath that filled the room. When I opened them again, I saw my reflection smiling back at me, and I knew I was ready. Jessica handed me my bouquet, a stunning arrangement of white peonies, garden roses, and eucalyptus that perfectly matched the rustic elegance of our venue. The grand ballroom at the Magnolia Hotel had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with twinkling lights, white linens, and centerpieces that took my breath away when I had seen them during the final walkthrough yesterday. 200 of our closest friends and family members were seated downstairs, waiting to witness Paul and me exchange vows that we had written ourselves. I had spent weeks perfecting mine, pouring my heart onto paper as I described how he had changed my life and how excited I was to build a future together. The thought of seeing his face when I walked down the aisle made my stomach flutter with anticipation and joy. My father appeared in the doorway, looking handsome in his black tuxedo, his eyes already misty with unshed tears. He had been emotional all morning, telling anyone who would listen how proud he was of the woman I had become, and how happy he was that I had found someone like Paul. Dad had always been protective of me, especially after my mother passed away 5 years ago, and his approval of Paul had meant everything to me. He extended his arm, and I slipped mine through his, feeling the solid warmth of his presence calm my nerves. We had practiced this walk so many times during rehearsal last night, but now it felt surreal, like I was floating through a dream. The string quartet began playing Pachelbel's Canon in D, and I knew it was time. As we made our way down the hallway toward the ballroom, I could hear the rustle of fabric as the guests stood to their feet. My heart was beating so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it, but it was a good kind of nervous energy, the kind that comes with anticipation and pure happiness. I thought about the honeymoon Paul and I had planned to Bali, the little house we had put an offer on in the Highlands neighborhood, and the children we wanted to have someday. Everything was falling into place exactly as we had dreamed, and I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The music swelled, and I could see the ornate double doors of the ballroom ahead of us, where my future husband was waiting for me at the altar. My father squeezed my arm gently and whispered, "You look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart. Your mother would be so proud." His words brought tears to my eyes, but I blinked them back, not wanting to ruin my makeup before the ceremony even began. I had felt her presence with me all morning, and I knew she was watching over us today. The doors opened, and I caught my first glimpse of the ballroom filled with our loved ones, all turned toward me with smiling faces. The aisle stretched out before me like a pathway to my new life, lined with white rose petals and flickering candles. At the end of it stood Paul in his black tuxedo, looking more handsome than I had ever seen him, with Andrew beside him as his best man. But as I took my first step into the ballroom, something caught my eye that made my blood run cold. There, standing near the front row in a dress that was identical to mine, down to the last bead and piece of lace, was Dorothy Chen, Paul's ex-girlfriend from college, the woman he had dated for 2 years before we met, the one he claimed he hadn't spoken to in over 3 years. She stood there with a serene smile on her face, her long black hair styled exactly like mine, wearing my dress like she belonged there. The guests around her were murmuring excitedly, some even starting to clap, as if this was some kind of planned surprise. My feet felt like they were made of lead, and I couldn't take another step forward, as the reality of what I was seeing began to sink in. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as I stood frozen in the doorway, my father's arm still linked with mine, his confused whisper of, "What's going on?" barely registering in my ears. Dorothy looked radiant, absolutely radiant, in my dress, or rather, an exact replica of it. Every intricate detail was there, the hand-sewn pearls along the bodice, the delicate lace sleeves that I had specifically requested, even the subtle train that pooled behind her feet in the exact same way mine did. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. How could she have gotten the same dress? How did she even know what it looked like? The designer had assured me it was a one-of-a-kind creation, something that existed nowhere else in the world. Yet there she stood, looking like my mirror image, while our wedding guests continued to applaud what they clearly thought was some kind of romantic gesture or surprise. I forced myself to look toward the altar where Paul stood, expecting to see shock or confusion on his face, some indication that this was as much a surprise to him as it was to me. Instead, what I saw made my stomach drop to my feet. He wasn't looking at me at all. His eyes were fixed on Dorothy with an expression I couldn't quite read. It wasn't surprise or anger or confusion. It was something else entirely, something that looked almost like relief mixed with guilt. Andrew, standing beside him as best man, was fidgeting with his tie and looking anywhere but at the scene unfolding before us. His face was flushed red, and beads of sweat had formed on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the ballroom. These were not the reactions of innocent men witnessing an unexpected disruption to our wedding day. The string quartet had stopped playing, and an uncomfortable silence fell over the room as more guests began to notice what was happening. I could hear whispers starting to ripple through the crowd. "Is that part of the ceremony? Why are there 2 brides? Did you know about this?" My Aunt Margaret, sitting in the 3rd row, had her hand pressed to her mouth in shock, while my cousin David was craning his neck to get a better look at Dorothy. The photographer, bless her heart, was still snapping pictures, probably thinking this was some kind of modern wedding trend she had never encountered before. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to ask Dorothy what the hell she thought she was doing, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me completely. Dorothy began walking toward the altar with slow, deliberate steps, her bouquet, white peonies and garden roses, just like mine, held gracefully in her hands. The guests parted for her like the Red Sea, some still clapping uncertainly, others beginning to realize that something was very wrong with this picture. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be walking down that aisle in that dress. My dress. The dress I had spent months designing, fitting, and perfecting. The dress that was supposed to be the most beautiful thing I ever wore, the centerpiece of the most important day of my life. Watching her wear it felt like watching someone steal my identity, my dreams, my entire future right in front of 200 witnesses. My father's grip on my arm tightened, and I could feel his confusion and growing anger radiating through his touch. "Michelle, what is this?" he whispered urgently. "Who is that woman, and why is she wearing your dress?" I opened my mouth to answer him, but no words came out. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I tell him that the woman walking toward my fiancé was his ex-girlfriend, someone who was supposed to be completely out of our lives? The rational part of my brain was screaming that there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding that would make all of this make sense. Maybe Dorothy had somehow gotten confused about the date. Or maybe this was some kind of elaborate prank that Paul had planned without telling me. But deep in my gut, I knew that wasn't true. As Dorothy reached the altar, she turned to face the congregation with a radiant smile, standing right beside Paul, as if she belonged there. The sight of them together, both dressed for a wedding, both looking like they were exactly where they were supposed to be, made bile rise in my throat. Paul finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes confirmed my worst fears. There was guilt there, yes, but also something that looked like pity. He looked at me like I was the intruder, like I was the one who didn't belong at this altar, in this dress, in this moment. Andrew stepped forward and cleared his throat, and I realized with growing horror that he was about to say something, to address the crowd as if this was all perfectly normal. The whispers in the crowd were getting louder now, and I could see my wedding guests looking back and forth between Dorothy and me like they were watching a tennis match. My college roommate Sarah was shaking her head in disbelief, while Paul's mother sat in the front row with her mouth hanging open, clearly as shocked as everyone else. Or was she? As I looked more closely at her face, I began to wonder if that expression was really surprise, or if it was something else entirely. Had she known about this? Had any of them known? The thought that this might have been planned, that people I trusted might have been in on whatever was happening, made my chest tighten with panic and betrayal. I realized I was still standing in the doorway like a statue, my father beside me, both of us frozen in this nightmare tableau. The photographer was still taking pictures, the videographer was still rolling, and 200 people were staring at us, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. I had to do something, say something, take control of this situation before it spiraled completely out of hand. But as I opened my mouth to speak, to demand answers, to reclaim my wedding day, Andrew raised his hand to quiet the crowd, and I knew with sinking certainty that whatever he was about to say would change everything forever. The fairy tale I had been living was about to become a horror story, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Andrew's voice boomed across the ballroom with a confidence that made my skin crawl. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here today to witness this very special occasion. His words were smooth and practiced, like he had rehearsed them, and the way he gestured toward both Dorothy and me made it clear that this was not an impromptu speech. As you can see, we have a bit of an unusual situation here, but I want to assure you that everything is exactly as it should be. The crowd murmured uncertainly, and I felt my father's body tense beside me as we both realized that Andrew was not about to clear up this confusion. He was about to make it worse. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me as the full weight of betrayal began to settle on my shoulders. Paul has asked me to explain to you all that love sometimes takes unexpected turns, Andrew continued, his eyes avoiding mine completely as he spoke. Sometimes we think we know what we want, but life has other plans for us. Sometimes the heart wants what it wants, and we have to be brave enough to follow it, even when it's difficult. The words hit me like physical blows, each one confirming what I was beginning to understand, but couldn't quite accept. This wasn't a mistake, or a misunderstanding, or some elaborate prank. This was intentional. This was planned. This was Paul choosing Dorothy over me on what was supposed to be our wedding day, in front of everyone we knew and loved. The humiliation was so intense, I thought I might vomit right there on the white rose petals scattered across the aisle. I watched in horror as Paul took Dorothy's hand in his, the same hand that had slipped an engagement ring on my finger 18 months ago, the same hand that had held mine through countless dates and conversations about our future together. Dorothy smiled up at him with the kind of radiant joy that should have been mine, and he looked down at her with an expression of such tenderness and relief that it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. They looked right together, in a way that made me feel like an outsider looking in on someone else's love story. How long had this been going on? How long had I been living in a fantasy while they planned this moment behind my back? The questions swirled in my mind like a tornado, destroying everything I thought I knew about my life. The crowd was beginning to understand what was happening, and the reactions were mixed and volatile. Some people were gasping in shock, others were whispering angrily, and a few were actually clapping as if this was the most romantic thing they had ever witnessed. Paul's college friends seemed to think this was some kind of grand romantic gesture, while my family and friends looked like they wanted to storm the altar and drag me away from this nightmare. My grandmother, sitting in her wheelchair in the front row, was clutching her pearls and shaking her head in disbelief. She had been so excited about this wedding, had traveled all the way from Florida to be here, and now she was witnessing the destruction of everything she had hoped for me. The sight of her confusion and disappointment broke something inside me. "Michelle," Paul finally spoke, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom as he addressed me directly for the first time since I had entered the room. "I'm sorry it had to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you, but I couldn't go through with this wedding knowing that my heart belongs to someone else." His words were like a slap across my face, delivered with such casual cruelty that I actually staggered backward. My father's arm around me was the only thing keeping me upright as the full reality of my situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. This man, who had proposed to me on bended knee in Washington Park, who had spent months planning this wedding with me, who had made love to me just last night while whispering about our future together, was publicly humiliating me in the most devastating way possible. Dorothy stepped forward then, and when she spoke, her voice was sweet and apologetic, but there was an underlying smugness that made my blood boil. "Michelle, I hope you can understand that Paul and I never stopped loving each other. We tried to stay apart. We really did, but some connections are just too strong to break." She held up her left hand, and I saw with shock that she was wearing an engagement ring. Not the same one Paul had given me, but a different one, bigger and more elaborate. When had he bought that? When had he proposed to her? How long had they been planning this while I was planning our wedding, choosing flowers and tasting cakes and sending out invitations to what I thought was going to be the happiest day of my life? The photographer was still taking pictures, capturing every moment of my humiliation for posterity, and I realized that this nightmare was being documented in high definition. These photos would exist forever, proof of the day my life fell apart in front of 200 people. I thought about the wedding album I had already ordered, the thank you cards I had pre-written, the honeymoon reservations that were probably non-refundable. Everything I had planned and dreamed about was crumbling around me, and I was standing there in my beautiful dress, the dress that no longer felt special or unique, watching it happen like a bystander at my own destruction. The irony wasn't lost on me that I looked absolutely perfect for a wedding that was never going to happen. My phone, tucked into Jessica's purse, began buzzing insistently, and I had a sudden, desperate hope that maybe this was all some kind of nightmare and someone was calling to wake me up. But as the reality of my situation continued to unfold before my eyes, I knew that no one was coming to save me from this. I was going to have to save myself, somehow, from the wreckage of what was supposed to be the best day of my life. The question was how to do it with any dignity intact. How to walk out of this ballroom with my head held high when everything inside me wanted to collapse into a sobbing heap on the floor. The fairy tale was over, but the story wasn't finished yet, and I was the only one who could decide how it would end. Something inside me snapped like a rubber band stretched too far, and suddenly, the paralysis that had held me frozen in the doorway broke. I pulled away from my father's protective arm and began walking down the aisle, not toward the altar where Paul and Dorothy stood like some twisted version of a bride and groom, but toward the side exit that led to the hotel's business center. I needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out what the hell was really going on here. The guests turned to watch me go, their faces a mixture of pity, confusion, and morbid curiosity, but I kept my chin up and my eyes straight ahead. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Not here. Not in front of everyone. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a steady rhythm that helped ground me as my world continued to spin out of control. The business center was mercifully empty, just a few computers and a printer humming quietly in the corner. I sank into one of the leather chairs and finally allowed myself to take a shaky breath. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone, and that's when I saw them. Dozens of text messages and missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize, from friends, from family members who weren't at the wedding. Word was already spreading somehow, probably through social media posts from guests who couldn't resist sharing this drama in real time. But it was the notification from Paul's iCloud account that made my blood run cold. We had shared our Apple IDs months ago for convenience, and I had never bothered to remove the access. Now I was seeing messages that were never meant for my eyes. With shaking fingers, I opened the message thread between Paul and Dorothy, and what I found there destroyed any remaining hope I had that this was some kind of misunderstanding. The messages went back months, filled with declarations of love, detailed plans for this exact moment, and discussions about how to handle the Michelle situation. They called me the Michelle situation, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a human being whose life they were destroying. I scrolled through message after message, each one more devastating than the last. "I can't wait to see her face when she realizes," Dorothy had written just yesterday. "It's going to be perfect," Paul had replied. "Andrew has everything planned out." The messages revealed the full scope of their deception with sickening clarity. They had never broken up. Their breakup 3 years ago had been fake, designed to throw me off the scent, while Paul pursued me as some kind of elaborate cover story. Dorothy had been living in Chicago, supposedly for work, but really so they could maintain their relationship without me finding out. The dress, my beautiful, one-of-a-kind dress, had been ordered by Paul himself, who had somehow gotten the designer's specifications and had an identical one made for Dorothy. Even the venue had been chosen specifically because it was where Paul had originally planned to marry Dorothy before I came into the picture. I was living in someone else's life, playing someone else's role, and I had never even known it. But the worst part, the part that made me actually gasp out loud in the quiet business center, was the plan for after the ceremony. They weren't just planning to humiliate me publicly, they were planning to steal from me too. The messages detailed how they intended to go through with some version of the ceremony, accept all the wedding gifts from our guests, and then disappear together on what was supposed to be my honeymoon to Bali. The reservations were already changed to Dorothy's name. The hotel suite I had booked for our wedding night was already transferred to her. They had planned to take everything, my dignity, my gifts, my honeymoon, my future, and leave me with nothing but the memory of this humiliation. I screenshot every message, my photographer's instincts kicking in even through my emotional devastation. Evidence. I needed evidence of what they had done. Proof that this wasn't just a case of cold feet or a change of heart, but a calculated, cruel deception that had been months in the making. As I scrolled through more messages, I found discussions about how to handle my family, how to spin the story to make it seem like Paul was the victim of his own heart rather than the architect of an elaborate con. They had even discussed what to do if I made a scene, with Andrew's role being to control the narrative and make sure the guests saw this as a romantic reunion rather than a betrayal. My phone rang, and Jessica's name appeared on the screen. I answered it with a voice that sounded steadier than I felt. "Michelle, where are you? Everyone's looking for you. Paul is asking—" "Don't," I interrupted her. "Don't tell me what Paul is asking. I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it right now without asking questions." I could hear the noise of the ballroom in the background, the confused chatter of guests who had no idea what to do with themselves in this unprecedented situation. "I need you to get my laptop from the bridal suite and bring it to the business center. And Jessica, bring the microphone from the DJ booth. Tell him the bride needs to make an announcement." As I waited for Jessica, I continued reading through the messages, each one adding another layer to my understanding of just how thoroughly I had been deceived. There were discussions about my personality, my habits, my insecurities, intimate details that Paul had shared with Dorothy so she could help him manipulate me more effectively. They had laughed about my excitement over wedding planning, my careful attention to every detail, my dreams of our future together. I had been a joke to them, a naive little girl playing dress-up while the adults made the real decisions about my life. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't about love or following your heart or any of the romantic nonsense Andrew had spouted. This was about two selfish people who thought they could use and discard me without consequences. Jessica appeared in the doorway with my laptop and the wireless microphone, her face pale and her eyes wide with concern. "Michelle, what's going on? Paul is telling everyone that you knew about this, that you agreed to step aside so he could be with his true love. People are starting to believe him." The rage that had been building inside me finally found its target. Of course he was rewriting the narrative, making himself the hero and me the understanding ex who graciously stepped aside for true love. Of course he was trying to steal even my right to be angry, my right to be the victim in this situation. But I had evidence now. proof of their deception, and I was about to show 200 people exactly who Paul Richardson really was. The fairy tale was over, but the real story was just beginning. I walked back into that ballroom with my laptop under one arm and the microphone in my hand, my wedding dress trailing behind me like a battle flag. The conversations died as I stepped up to the altar where Paul and Dorothy still stood, and I smiled at the crowd with a sweetness that didn't reach my eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with whatever this is supposed to be, I think you all deserve to know the truth about the man you came here to celebrate today, I said into the microphone, then opened my laptop and began reading their messages aloud. Every cruel word, every calculated lie, every detail of their plan to humiliate and rob me. By the time I finished, Paul's face was white as his boutonniere. Dorothy was crying, and our guests were on their feet demanding answers. But I was already walking toward the exit, my head held high, finally free of the lies that had been my life for 3 years.